Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Mental Walks conversation series today on what the budget means for you. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that we are sitting on the ancient lands of the First Peoples and to pay our deepest respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I am more than delighted today to have these two wonderful women here to share their insights with us. Firstly, Shirelle Murphy, Senior Economist with the ANZ Bank. There are not too many women in Australia who are Senior Economists with the ANZ or any leading bank, and we are really, really pleased to have her with us. And also Kate McCallum, a wonderful wealth advisor, financial commentator, and the co-author of The Joy of Money, a truly fantastic book for women about money and how you can and should be approaching it. The way today will work is that Shirelle will kick off with the big picture of the budget, and Kate will then take it down to more about what it means for us. The opportunity is for questions at the end of the session today, which will go for an hour. And please feel free to post your questions throughout the session, so don't feel that you have to wait before you put them on the chat session, on the chat function. So once again, thank you for joining us. Adina Jacobs and I, the co-founders of Mental Walks, are delighted to be hosting this series. We are recording it so that if you miss or you need to leave early or you'd like to hear it again or share it with your friends, it will be there for you on our social media pages. So without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Shirelle Murphy.
Thank you, everyone. I apologise. My speaker and my camera were working as we started, and then they just went and zapped out, which I've never had happen to me before. So my apologies. So, and thank you so much, Kate, for continuing to get on with the questions. I just wanted to give you an overview of the budget. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but just sort of set the scene really, and give you the big picture. What do I need to know about? As you can see, I've entitled this presentation "Lots of Sugar and Not a Lot of Protein," and that's mainly because, as we know, the government has spent a lot of money, but I'm not sure that it's necessarily spent it in the right places. And I'll explain that a little bit further as we go along. That's not to say that we think this is a bad budget. We don't. It's just that there are a few nuances along the way. Now, as we know, going into this budget, the economy was not in a good shape at all. And of course, the budget is very much a reaction to the fact that the economy has recessed right through to the June quarter. We know that almost all industries across the economy had actually lost jobs in the last 6 months. The only industries that have avoided job losses are those in the bottom, which, as you can see, health, the finance sector, utilities and public admin. So that's obviously your the public service there. Business confidence had been given a really big kick, and in fact, we saw business confidence fall to levels that we had never seen before. There has been a very strong rebound in business confidence, but even compared to historical levels, it's still really quite low. Business conditions also is more, I guess, contemporaneous way of thinking about how business is thinking about the economy, and that too is below where it's been for a long time, really as low as it's been since around 2012, 2013. No surprises there. Obviously, the state of the economy following the immediate news of COVID was a really large negative piece of information for businesses to try and absorb, understand, and then, of course, react to as the government effectively shut down the economy, and of course continues to do so in Victoria. Consumers too, unsurprisingly, reported very, very low levels of confidence going into the budget. Now, this is a survey that we do with Roy Morgan, and we survey consumers every week. We ask about 1,200 consumers, so that's just everyday households like you and I, and we ask them, you know, what are you thinking about a variety of things, particularly what the economic outlook is and how you're feeling about your own personal finances. Now, as I say, no surprise that consumer confidence fell very sharply in late March, early April. But what was, I guess, interesting about this result is that consumers were reporting much more negative conditions about the economy more generally, so that's the orange line, than they were about their own personal finances, which suggests to me that the government's measures to try and help consumers with obviously measures like the job seeker and the coronavirus supplement to JobKeeper were actually keeping households feeling a little bit better about themselves than they might have otherwise, and certainly better than they were about the economy in general. Now, while all this is going on, of course, the Reserve Bank has been very active in trying to do what it can to try and stimulate the economy. Of course, the Reserve Bank and the government are the two main institutions which can really help us through this. And the Reserve Bank lowered the cash rate down to 0.25%. As you well know, the interest rates are now historically low. This chart here is just showing us what the money markets are thinking about the RBA cash rate going forward. In other words, what is the RBA cash rate likely to be in 5 years' time? And I just wanted to pull that up because it shows that the markets are not only very comfortable, of course, with the fact that the RBA has taken rates down this low. In fact, they might even take them even lower. But the fact that they will continue to stay here. So in other words, the market's looking for the cash rate to remain at around about 0.25% for 5 years. Now that's a pretty extraordinary observation from the market, and something that, again, we've just never seen this before. So it does give us some confidence that we can bank on rates being low for a very long period of time, certainly several years into the future. The government, of course, when they came up with this budget, they had decided already that they were going to spend a lot of money, and certainly had started doing so with the JobKeeper payments. They then added to that, of course, the tax cuts, and we saw both household and business tax cuts, as Kate's been talking about, and a number of other measures, smaller measures, but nonetheless adding up altogether to $214 billion. So as we went into this crisis, the budget was just about in balance. The government was just about to report a surplus. And then whammo, here we are, 2021, the government is expecting a cash deficit of $214 billion. Again, this is numbers like we haven't seen in the past, since World War II anyway, when there was a huge increase in military spending. If you want to compare this to the GFC, just have a look at this area here, 2008 and 9, and you can see that really the spend well and truly pushes beyond what the government had to do in the global financial crisis as well. Look, lots of sugar in this. In other words, lots of temporary small-time hits. There has been a big increase in stimulus in the very, very short term, and that will not necessarily last very long. From here, obviously, that stimulus starts to pull back a little bit and comes into slightly smaller deficits going forward. So my son's just walked into the room, good timing. So look, we're going to be in deficit for a very long time. And does that matter? Well, for the most part, no, it doesn't. And I'll come back a little bit to that later on. Again, just another way of thinking about this is to break that deficit down into both payments and receipts. And again, the statistic just says to me that the spend here is just unprecedented. You look at that blue line, that is payments as a percentage of GDP. It's up around 35%. So in other words, more than 1 in 3 of every dollar that's spent in the economy this year will be on the budget. So that will be by the Commonwealth, I should say. So again, it just puts into perspective just how large the spending is at the moment. Receipts, of course, also fall because we've had tax cuts. So the government is sacrificing some of its normal receipts. But at the same time, because the economy is growing slowly, receipts do also shrink. Of course, there's less profit in the economy and less income tax being paid by households. So that starts to fall away a little bit too. Consequences for debt, of course, is that our Commonwealth debt goes up, and it goes up by a lot. We're now looking at a debt forecast of 50% of GDP. That just means essentially it would take half a year's output from the entire economy to pay off the stock of debt that the Commonwealth now holds. These numbers, I think, are very hard to get your head around. For most people, they don't really mean very much. It just means that we have an awful lot of debt and it's going to take an awful lot of time to pay off. There will be consequences, of course, down the track, but the government is certainly not in any hurry to try and make up that debt or try and pull it back in. One thing I will note here, though, is that the interest paid as a result of having all that debt does not increase. And that's because, of course, interest rates are so low. So the fact that the Reserve Bank has lowered rates, it has kept them low right across the yield curve. So at 3-year debt and 10-year debt, all of it is very, very cheap for the government. And so interest costs remain less than 1% of GDP. And interestingly, as you can see, they actually fall very, very slightly over time, which is just one of those amazing flips of how powerful interest rates are across an economy, and in this case for government. You would have noticed, of course, that some of the budget measures are very focused on young people, and of course that reflects the fact that young people have been one of the biggest losers in the employment market out of the COVID situation. This chart here just shows the payroll employment numbers, and it's just an index, so it just shows how each of these age cohorts moves relative to each other. And you can see if we started in mid-March that the 15 to 24-year-olds lost far more jobs than the rest of the economy. And that's, of course, why we have the government putting in a wage subsidy for the under 35 and also extra measures to try and support apprenticeships across the economy. So, you know, it's hard to argue that doesn't make sense at this point in time, given they have lost many more jobs relatively. What we do know, though, about going forward is that we are not going to be supported by the government as much as we have been or will be in this current financial year. So the JobKeeper payment in total adds up to $101 billion. Most of that has been spent already, but we still have a bit more to go in the current quarter and in the March and the June quarters next year. It will gently taper off. Well, I say gently, but the truth is it's not so gentle because of the sheer size of it. In other words, all this money that's been going into the economy over the last 6 months will now start to slow down. It will not be replaced by other support measures. So the JobKeeper payment, as I said, gets smaller in the December quarter, and the household support payments, and by that I mean the one-off payments to particularly pensioners and allowance holders, falls down to $250 in 2 installments. And prior to the budget, obviously, we had 2 $750 installments. Even the tax cuts, when you look at how big those are over 2021, they are only about $6 billion. I say only, but relative to JobKeeper, as you can see, that's pretty small. So we're not getting nearly as much put back in as JobKeeper starts to filter out. Now, why is that? Well, of course, it's because the government simply cannot continue to spend at that rate. And neither is it just a good policy for the government to do so. People, of course, would have no incentive to go and find a job if they were getting $1,500 a fortnight for essentially doing very little. So we're seeing that that shift for very good fiscal reasons, and don't expect the government to back down on that, because it certainly won't. I just want to talk very briefly about the tax cuts, because there has been a bit of criticism about tax cuts being very much geared to the high end of the income scale. It is true that those who are at the high end of the income scale, so I'm talking sort of $200,000 plus, will get more dollars back in tax cuts. But of course, that is because they pay many more dollars. So as the proportion of the tax that you actually pay, it's those right at the bottom end of the tax scale who get the most back. So they will get about, if you're on a $40,000 annual income, you get about 21% of your income back. Whereas if you're on a $200,000 salary, you only get about 3 to 4% of your income back with these tax cuts. So it is proportionate, and I think for people just to suggest that it's entirely unfair is not really looking at that kind of detail. It certainly suggests that it is more scaled than you might think. As we know, women also have suffered, as well as young people more generally in the COVID crisis, with many of the jobs lost being those for those very tactile type industries. So things like, as you all know, hospitality, even parts of health, recreation, industries which tend to be dominated by women and women's employment. Now, the budget has been clearly very heavily criticised for not doing enough for women. I just pulled out some headlines from over the weekend, and tell you what, it wasn't hard to find a lot of articles which were very critical of the fact that the budget did not do more for women. There was a women's economic security package, but it was costed at $240 million over 4 years. Now, that sounds like a lot of money, but in budget terms, it's not. As I said, the JobKeeper payment is $101 billion. So it's very different. There's not a lot being put in here. And of course, the Labor Party has tried to differentiate itself on the basis of the fact that it would do more for women, would do more for families, and it's obviously put in place, or would put in place if it were elected to government, a very generous childcare policy where most households would find 90% of the childcare costs covered. I am not for 1 minute suggesting, by the way, that childcare is a women's issue. There's, of course, a family issue. That is one way that the Labor Party have tried to differentiate themselves from the government, and I suspect that that's going to work in their favour. And given it was a big spending budget with lots and lots of generous policies put out there, I think that was quite a hard ask, actually, to try and come up with something to look, I guess, a little bit more in tune with the Australian public. So now here's the protein. This is what I was talking about before. While we've had an increase in this so-called sugar, this very short-term hit, the tax cuts being brought forward, the slight additions to household payments, we didn't see a big increase in the government's capital spending. Now, that very much fits with the narrative of the government saying, you know, we want the household sector to go out and the household and the business sector to go out and actually grow, and we don't want we don't want to be fitting that role anymore. We want to step back and let the private sector really get on with things. And this is another example of how we can see that. This is the government's capital spending plans. Now, if you just concentrate on the blue line here, which is capital spending as a share of GDP, you can see it does jump up from about 2.5% of GDP to 3% this financial year, but the intention of the government is to leave it there and to continue to spend at that rate. Now, by capital spending, what I'm talking about here is government's actual direct investment into its own capital. Things like defence spending would fit into that category, so spending on big artillery vehicles, etc. But it also is government spending into in terms of grants to the states and territories, and it's also investments into the government's own enterprises, things like the NBN or the Western Sydney Airport Corporation. So it doesn't have big spending plans there. There was no new huge projects announced, and of course this tends to be liked by economists because the types of capital spending generally is the sort of things that will lead to a more productive future because you're investing in the capital base of the Australian economy. Now, if I just have to sort of sum it all up, will the budget work? Well, the government thinks it's certainly going to bring down the unemployment rate forecast, but certainly not straight away. They're looking at unemployment staying relatively high through to the middle of next year, which of course is, you know, really where this all matters. This is where there's a huge sort of human element of what's going on. But from there on, and it does expect unemployment to come down. Now, we think that they're actually even being a little bit optimistic. Their unemployment rate forecasts are certainly below ours, and they are below the Reserve Bank's, which is what this chart is telling us. The government have said that they would like to get unemployment rate down below 6% again, but they don't expect that to happen until 23-24, the financial year 23-24. So that's a long time where we're going to be experiencing, I guess, less than optimal economic conditions, and the budget therefore will really need to do a lot of work. In other words, there could be more spending coming up. So I'll just finish up here by noting that, again, and just making this point, that the extraction of the JobKeeper payment from the economy, in other words, tapering down, will make a big difference to the overall economy. The government, which is currently spending around about $68 billion per quarter, or was spending $68 billion per quarter in the September quarter, will take that right down to about $25 billion in the current quarter. That is 8% of GDP that falls out of the economy straight away, just because, mainly because JobKeeper is tapered down. So in other words, the private sector has to make up a lot of that spending for us not to see GDP fall into the negative again. It is quite possible that the December quarter GDP will be negative. We expect that, well, we hope that it will be positive, and that is our core forecast, but the risk of a negative number is certainly not far away. So it will be a bumpy ride, but we'd have to say that this budget certainly puts a lot of sweetness into the economy. It's going to make it slightly easier than it was otherwise, but really there wasn't an awful lot in the budget to make us feel like the government has a longer term reform plan, a longer term plan to get the economy back on its feet. Now that may be coming, I'm not suggesting it's not, but in this budget, it's been more about that sugar. Thank you very much, and I will pass back to Kate.
Thank you. Well, certainly a lot of detail. Thank you, Cherelle. And great job of pulling out the thing. There is a lot more detail in the budget. We'll give you more detail on specific things if you're interested in them. I'm going to turn now to some of your questions, because we've got some great questions, and I think they're very valid, and they're things that, while we might not be able to give you the answers that you would like to hear, at least we can perhaps explain a little bit more about what is proposed in the budget, and give us an understanding of where the government perhaps hasn't addressed particular segments of our community. The first question, Shirelle, relates to people who are not employed. So when you look at these tax cuts, which are very much a centrepiece of this federal budget, that obviously assists people who are in employment rather than people who are not employed. And the question is, what has been included, particularly for women who may be unemployed?
Yeah, not a lot at all. In fact, as I was saying before, there are some little additional household payments that will go to those on allowances or benefits, which is essentially those who are not employed. But they're only, as well as the normal payments, an addition of two discrete $250 sums of money. So essentially what is the additions being put into that sector adds up to about $2 billion, which, you know, again, just going back to the sort of numbers we're talking about, is very small in the scheme of things. And it really means that if you don't have a job, really most of the benefits, or I shouldn't say benefits, but most of the support that you've had so far has basically been and gone. And so there really isn't much more coming for those particular individuals, unfortunately.
And I think it's definitely something that I'm very concerned about as a financial advisor, and Bobbi and I have talked a lot about this as well, is that even if we think about superannuation, superannuation is fundamentally a structure that supports people who are employed. And it's very difficult for people who have breaks from the workforce or face periods of unemployment to have the same contributions into superannuation. And it just means that for our older workers, we need to find additional support mechanisms that are, I think, a more persistent or sustained support measure in the economy. Brings us to a second question, which is the one of older workers. And I was intrigued to see that the initiatives around JobMaker, and JobMaker is the initiative that the government has put in place to provide salary credits to people who employ individuals who've been unemployed, but it's capped at the age of 35. So Shirelle, I'm interested in your comments on the JobMaker program, but also, again, if there's anything in the budget to support older workers.
Yeah, again, this is a point that several news articles focused on the weekend, is the fact that by supporting younger workers, are you therefore excluding older workers, which is of course not something that we want to do either. Particularly when we look at older women who, let's face it, their struggle in the workforce and getting into the workforce when they've been out or they haven't been connected to the workforce for a long time. It's hard enough as it is, and now there seems to be a sort of an incentive in place to hire younger workers. Does that make it even more difficult? I think there's two parts to that. One is, yes, on the face of things, it does change that balance, and it's not in favour of older workers. And for what I can see, there's nothing in this budget for older workers. However, there are, I believe, and I don't have the details, but there are, I believe, a number of incentives for employers to take on older workers, and they have been in the budget for some time. So, or they have been in the government system for some time. So we're not starting from scratch here, but in terms of new incentives, no, there was, from what I could see, there wasn't anything else in there. So that's not ideal. This kind of ageism, I guess, in the budget is clearly designed to help young people, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if it's going to actually exclude older workers, then I'd say that's a problem.
And I think, again, just as we've talked about women being disproportionately impacted by job losses, I think we're talking about older women have a double jeopardy impact. And I know for some of my clients who, would be in the last sort of 10 or 15 years of their working life, are very concerned about the health impacts as well of returning to work in certain sectors, particularly if they're in the healthcare sector or the childcare sector. Shirelle, if we talk specifically about JobMaker, and a question came through from somebody who is a small business owner who would like to employ somebody to provide them with an opportunity. We know that JobMaker is a 12-month incentive for businesses, and it commenced on the 7th of October, so unfortunately we can't backdate it. And we know that it's $200 a week for people under age 29, so 16 to 29, and then 30 to 35, it's $100 a week. Do you have more information on who is eligible, so the employees that are eligible for that?
I think, well, I must admit, I don't have much information on that other than the fact that they have to be unemployed. So you can't sort of pick someone up from another role and get that subsidy. It has to be someone who doesn't have a job. That's obviously the intention of the government, is to allow people who may have had a job pre-COVID but have become unemployed to get them back into the workforce, rather than, I guess, an incentive to hire a young person full stop. But look, I would suggest with this that if you need more information, then by all means go on to the Treasury website, go on to budget.gov.au, because everything is in there. And if you just use your little Control F, find key and type in JobMaker, I can guarantee you that the information will be easy to find in there. I'd say easy. That's probably not quite true.
A couple of interesting things which I have uncovered, because I've had several clients ask me about this. So the employee must have either received job seeker, so have been unemployed, youth allowance, or a parenting payment for at least one of the previous 3 months at the time of hiring. They can't be receiving the other wage subsidies like the apprenticeship funding, and they need to work at least 20 paid hours a week on average, so you can't have them for less than that.
I think, Shirelle, if you are still with us, would you like to take on some of the questions that are in the chat function while we wait for Kate to come back in?
Absolutely. You can hear me okay?
You can.
Great. Okay. So I'm reading here one question. When did the tax cuts come into effect? So they are effectively starting on the 1st of July this year, which was a bit of a surprise. You'll remember that the last 2 budgets also had tax cuts in them. And so it's a bit of a mess in terms of trying to work out what started when and where and how much. But essentially, everyone in their next paycheck should see a reduction in tax. The legislation was taken straight to Parliament, so it should come in straight away. And so you will see a lower rate of tax come out of your, or a lower amount of tax come out of your paycheck, next paycheck. However, in terms of getting back that extra tax that you've now effectively paid from the 1st of July to now, we'll have to wait until the end of the financial year for that. And so you have to put your tax return in and claim it that way. No surprise that that's coming in the year before an election, just saying. And so it will be, you have to wait a little bit. It's not like we're kind of going to get a cash lump sum to reflect that until we actually put our tax returns in for this year.
Okay.
So I just go to the next question.
Yeah.
Bobbi?
Question about if you've got a crystal ball, when would you predict that we might return to a pre-COVID economy? Thank you, Helen Graney, for that question.
Yeah, so the crystal ball would tell us, or at least within the ANZ research team, we're looking at the end of 2022, really before we get back to what the economy was like in December 2019. That's pretty extraordinary, obviously, in the sense that, you know, we've normally got an economy which moves forward at the rate of about, 2 to 3% a year reasonably easily. And when you take away that growth and you go backwards, of course, as we did through the March and the June quarters, it takes a long time to rebuild that, even if COVID completely disappears from the equation. So yeah, it's going to be a good few years, unfortunately.
And Cherelle, I'm interested in the issue of inflation. Low interest rates are one thing, but what's your view on inflation?
It's a good question because, on one hand, you might expect that all this stimulus going into the economy could lead to inflation, in the sense that, we've suddenly got a lot more money being floated through business and households, and we've seen that in the national accounts. You can see that income going up. That should lead to more demand in the economy, and demand normally leads to inflation. But we really haven't had an inflation issue since the global financial crisis. So we've kind of gone through 10 years already where inflation was not much of a problem. And yet, the Reserve Bank continue to target 2 to 3% inflation rate, as do most central banks around the world. They target inflation somewhere in that range. And they've really not been able to get much above that, even with all the stimulus that came into the economy in monetary terms. And by that, of course, I mean lower interest rates for the last 10 years. So I think, we're actually into a bit of a strange and quite different regime. So my volume for some reason has just come back. I'm going to turn it off so I don't get an echo here. 1 second. Yeah, so we're now in a situation, I think, where there is definitely more going on with the inflation issue than has in the past, and it is much more difficult to predict a rise in inflation. So, we may see pockets of the economy where there are inflationary forces, don't get me wrong, and we've we've heard about, for example, demand for engineers and to build tunnels and up in the mines, etc. And there may be a bit of wage inflation there, but I think as a generalised prospects for the economy, it's very hard to see inflation picking up for a very long time.
Right. There's also a question here from Mel Norton about the 35.9 million over 5 years from 20 to 21 that includes 6.5 million in 24 to 25 to increase the number of co-founder grants to women-founded startups under the Boosting Female Founders initiative, and to provide access to expert mentoring and advice for women entrepreneurs. What's your view of those initiatives?
As far as I know, that's part of the women's security package, or I can't remember exactly what they called it, but look, to be honest, I don't have much of a view other than to say that it's not really very much money. So, great, it sounds like an incredibly useful thing to do, but across the whole economy, that is not a lot of money. Of course, to some organisations, though, it might mean a lot, and I'm not for 1 second trying to de-emphasise that, but again, I think we would like to see more.
Yeah. There is also a question, how does the budget affect first home buyers, particularly those looking to buy in the next 2 years?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Two things to note here. One is that there was an additional benefit for first home buyers, first home builders actually, in the budget. And again, just go on to budget.gov.au to see the details of that. That builds on an existing package that was already in place before the budget. And I'd also add very importantly here is that the state budgets have been doing a lot too for first home buyers. So not only do you have, if you're willing to build a home, the home builder scheme, most of the states have got some kind of addition to that. And then on top of that, there are stamp duty concessions for first home buyers across most of the states and territories as well. I think the most generous package when you add all those up is in Western Australia. And actually, Western Australia has seen an absolute surge in land sales as a response to this, to a record. The packages are not so generous elsewhere, but they're still very good. In WA, I think you can get up to something like $69,000 towards the cost of building your first home if you're in that category. In other states and territories, it's not as much as that, but I think it's starting at about $35,000. So it's a great time to go and build a home if you fit into that category of a first home buyer and you're willing to build as opposed to just buy.
Right. Shirelle, can we ask you a few questions about superannuation? There were developments in super that were referenced in the budgets in terms of greater transparency, rollovers and so forth. Can you just give us a bit more detail around that, please?
I would love to give you detail around that, but it's not really my area, to be honest. But again, there was a very specific paper in the budget papers on this. Again, going to budget.gov.au, it's all laid out there. My understanding, and please don't quote me on this, is that this is actually more of a proposal than actually a committed change. So have a look at that. Kate may know the answer to that. If we get her back, we can perhaps go back on to that one.
Okay.
I'm here.
Oh, that's about super.
You know the answer.
Look, I do. The one thing I would say is that the best news in the budget was that there was no major reform to superannuation. Because I don't know about you, but I am fatigued by the level of change that we've seen to superannuation in the last 10 years. Specifically with these superannuation measures, there's three that I'll mention. One is what they call fund stapling. And this is an initiative to try to stop people ending up with a plethora of superannuation funds. So the proposal is that if you have an existing superannuation fund, you join a new employer, that new employer has to make your contributions into your existing fund, not their preferred employer fund. Now, of course, you can elect to change that, but by default, the idea is that you don't end up with a new fund every time you change employers. So that's the fund stapling initiative. The second initiative is called Your Super, and it's a super comparison tool. So the idea behind this is that the government will actually provide a very easy to access comparison tool, and they'll start with the default funds, the My Super funds, and they'll give you an idea of what the costs are, the investment fees, the investment choices, and some other key information. There's been comparison tools around previously, but this is the first one that's being supported by the government. The third initiative is a proposal for a superannuation performance test. And the idea behind this is to stop people getting stuck in underperforming funds. So if a fund has more than 2 years of underperformance against a benchmark, then it won't be able to accept new members. There's not a lot of detail on these. And as Shirelle said, there's still proposals in their very early stages.
Fantastic. At this point, I'm conscious of time, and I think we have travelled through all the questions. If anyone has one that's we've missed out, if you'd like to just quickly type it back in chat, that would be much appreciated. It doesn't look like anything is coming in. I do particularly want to thank Kate and Shirelle for valiantly coping with technology issues we've had today, and also to all of you that have participated today. Thank you for your patience with us as we navigated tech issues, but I hope the great information that Kate and Shirelle have shared has managed to come through. So thank you very much for participating, and we look forward to seeing you in some of the future conversation series we're holding that we will be sharing information with you about on social media. Thank you so much, and have a great evening.
Thanks, Bobbi. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.